Geek Therapy Radio.
Welcome to the Geek Therapy Radio podcast. I am your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. Thank you so much from the bottom of my geek heart for joining me yet again for another podcast. And just to let you in behind the curtain a little bit for all of those audio engineers out there, or audio engineers in wait, I guess. Maybe you're dabbling with audio engineering. I'll plug right now that if you haven't listened to my interview with Chris Henderson of Handy Amps, you should go listen to that, because if you're dabbling in audio, that will help you out a lot. There's a lot of cool concepts we discussed and a lot of just geeky goodness in there. But to let you behind the curtain, those of you interested, I am speaking in this podcast at least through an MXL V67G. It costs about $90 to $100, and this microphone I actually bought back in 2003, but I'll go back into the microphone in a second because there's kind of an interesting story behind it. The microphone preamp that I'm running into is a Handy Amps prototype called Everything. I don't even know what Everything is on this microphone preamp. I know that it's a combo mic preamp and guitar amplifier. So I can plug in a guitar and run an output into a guitar cabinet speaker, basically, and that's the dual purpose. That's why it's Everything. Amongst other things, there's line inputs, DI input, direct injection inputs, gain and trim for the tubes, boost. There's actually a high cut filter, low cut filter. Did I say phase inversion? 48 volts phantom power. There are switches on here that not even Chris knows what they do. And one of the reasons why, and I mean that in the most endearing, awesome way possible, he let me borrow this prototype. Again, this is a prototype amp from Handy Amps. Prototype mic preamp, prototype guitar preamp, all in one. I have not even begun to test all the abilities of it, but one reason why he let me use it for an indeterminate amount of time, and Chris, if you're listening, just let me know if and when you want it back. I'm just having too much fun with this, but he wanted me to put it through its paces and kind of test it, and he's like, figure out what this switch does. I don't remember how I wired this up. For instance, on channel 1 here, there's a switch just right next to the channel 1 logo that's not marked, and all the markings on the face of this unit are labels that he's just printed out, like you would label sandwich containers and like arts and crafts. He just has the labels over these switches, but there's a couple switches on here that don't have a label on it. I asked him what engage meant, because I'm huge into Star Trek, and what does the switch engage mean? What does it engage? I'm not sure. He gave me a list. And that's what's fun. I mean, that's what's fun about electronics. And that's kind of what I want to talk about in this podcast, is what I've been up to recently. I didn't record a podcast last night. It got really late, but I've been up to plenty in the past few days. I've been geeking out about plenty of stuff. So it's really fun to geek out with Chris and test this prototype microphone / guitar tube preamp thing. And remember from our interview, he's running these tubes at a proper 400 to 450 volts. I have a mic pre next to me. It's awesome. Universal Audio 4710D. It's 4 channels of tube and FET solid state preamplification, and the tubes in there I believe run at 300 volts, which is by all means a great voltage to run tubes at. The higher voltage you run tubes at, the higher headroom and more gain you get out of it, more clarity and punch. So just about the limits for most tubes is between 440, 150 volts. So that's where Chris runs them in his gear. The power supplies in Chris's gear, I guarantee you the power supply component itself cost more than whatever power supply they're using in the mass marketed Universal Audio. And I don't mean to disparage the UA unit at all. It's an absolutely exquisite front end for a serious home studio or even a professional studio. It is an absolutely amazing unit, but nothing compares to the way a hand-built microphone preamp costs when you're running those tubes at the top of their range, 450 volts. All right, so I'm geeking out about that right now. So the interesting story, I put a pin in this idea earlier. I was going to tell you about my MXL V67G. It cost $100, and it sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Especially running through a Handy amp preamp. You've heard this microphone before, the MXL V67G. You've heard it before running through the UA, my universal audio mic preamp. You've heard it running straight into, I don't know, my Tascam. You've heard it run into audio interfaces before. It's a great sounding mic. So I bought it in 2003. It was about $100 back then. I have had this microphone, what is it now? 2019, about to be 2020. I've had this microphone, and I just got a wave of sadness as I'm thinking about this. Got this microphone 17 years ago. It's still a microphone that you can buy right now. Just type in V67G and you'll find it. It's a very good microphone. I mean, you can hear it. It's a very, very, very good microphone, especially for $100. So the history of this microphone is that I've had it. It's been in storage for quite some time. I would say out of its 17-year life, it's spent a good 7 to 10 years of that time in storage, out of use. And it's not great to have microphones in storage. I do not believe that I had this mic in any sort of case, any sort of official microphone case, which would have helped. But at any rate, I was afraid that it had gotten dust on the capsule, on the diaphragm inside, that even though it has its screen around it, that dust is small, and if it's been sitting around for that many years doing nothing, literally collecting dust, surely dust has gotten through that screen and got into the capsule. So I thought to myself, you know what, it's risky. I'm going to clean the capsule / diaphragm. And by diaphragm, here's what I mean. With a condenser microphone or any microphone, it's got a diaphragm. That's what vibrates when your sound waves of your voice or an instrument or whatever's being played into the microphone, it vibrates the diaphragm. And in a good condenser microphone, large diaphragm condenser microphone like this MXL V67G, that diaphragm is extremely thin. It's measured in microns. It is much thinner than a human hair, and it's gold plated. It's spattered in gold plating. So it's very thin, very delicate, and gold plated. It is not something that you just want to open up and clean willy-nilly, like with a tissue or a cloth or anything like that. No, guaranteed you'll destroy it. It's a very delicate device. So I said, I'm going to risk it. It's $100. I bought it 17 years ago. I'm just going to open this thing up and I'm just going to risk it. I'm just going to clean it. So I got out the isopropyl alcohol and the softest Q-tips God ever did make. I think I Amazoned it from heaven itself. Super delicate Q-tips. And first swipe, I took some of the gold plating off of the diaphragm. I was like, well, there you go. Just what I feared. I've screwed it. I've screwed it all up. This thing is bunk. It's going to be terrible. I have just altered the sound. When you're measuring in microns, surely me scraping off some of the gold instantly with rubbing alcohol was a bad move. Will be hereafter known as Johnny Dunn effed up. So I thought, what the heck, I'll put it all back together. I finished kind of cleaning it ever so delicately. I didn't take off any more gold, but if I saw any dust, I kind of got it off. I did a decent job cleaning it after I rubbed some of the gold off of it. I put it back together, and the mic sounded better than before. I improved the mic in that mistake. It was a happy mistake. Like Bob Ross says, there's no accidents, just happy mistakes. I made this $100 microphone sound even better. I added more air and more kind of, I don't want to call it sizzle, because sizzle is kind of a bad word when it comes to microphone and high end. It just has some air to it. It breathes some life to the higher frequencies of this microphone. And it makes sense because I basically made the diaphragm, what vibrates and reacts with the sound waves of your voice, I made that lighter. So it can move more freely. Since it's lighter, there's less mass to move back and forth. So it's just sharper, crisper, more air in the top end. And I've actually improved this microphone, but it was already great beforehand. So if you're getting into podcasting, and I'll put a pin in that notion in a second, if you're getting into podcasting or recording music or anything like that, I do recommend the MXL V67G. MXL is not paying me to say this. This is just, I've had this microphone longer than I've had a Shure SM57 or 58. Those are both workhorses. I would say, though, if you had to only have one microphone in your arsenal to do everything with, that is, record guitars, record vocals, record drums, record horns, record anything, the one microphone that I recommend you have for everything is a Shure SM57. They cost about $90, $100. Sometimes they go on sale, maybe $80. You could run over that thing with an 18-wheeler semi. If you're listening in the UK, with a lorry. You could drop it off a skyscraper. It will kill somebody before the microphone itself gets killed. It is a hefty unit. It is a absolute beast. Tank of a microphone, and it sounds great on everything, and it takes EQ so well. So there are microphones, for instance, there are better microphones to use on a vocal in most cases. But if all you have is an SM57, you can use it on a vocal, any vocal, male or female, and EQ it to taste. It takes EQ very well. There's some microphones that you EQ and you just can never get them to sound right. I despise cheap, natty microphones. I do have one natty that is okay, and that is, I think it's Natty D112. It's a clone. It's used on a kick drum. It's designed for bassy signals. So kick drums, bass cabinets, what have you. That's the only natty that I have in my arsenal that I can get a decent sound out of. Do yourself a favor if you're getting into music or recording or podcasting or broadcasting or anything like that. Do not buy a natty. I know it's tempting because you can buy 10 natty microphones for what it costs to buy one Shure. But believe me, one Shure SM57 will last you your entire life and sound great on everything you put it on, versus none of the 10 natties you buy that sounds like shh on everything. Do not buy natty. Natty, if you're listening, don't even sponsor me. I will feel bad pimping your product. I'll try your products, sure, if you want to change my mind, but I think I've kind of shot myself in the foot with sponsorship. But I don't think there's a natty product out there that's wooed me to date. MXL makes some good microphones. You do, for the most part, get what you pay for. Like, let's say if you pay $30 for an MXL, I think it's a $990 condenser microphone. It sounds good. For the price, $50 below, whatever it is, sounds really good. But doesn't last very long. I've got one in a case back there somewhere, and I tried to use it. It's developed a hum, and the hum can be, that can be on my end. But I've got this V67G in the same signal chain, and it doesn't hum. But the 990 hums until you touch it. When you touch the case of it, it stops humming. So there's some sort of grounding issue happening within the microphone itself. It's not the cable. I've tested with different cables. MXL 990, good microphone. If you take care of it, you kind of get what you pay for it. Okay, so podcasting, like I mentioned, I put a pin in that notion. I have had several people well, by several, I mean a handful over the past couple weeks. They're very creative people, and they feel stymied, kind of staggered. And usually they're musicians. They feel kind of this pent-up creative juice. Maybe they're in a writer's block, creative block. They're just not feeling that they're getting any sort of artistic satisfaction or anything like that. And they're just kind of just talking to me. And one of the things I recommend to them, and I recommend it to anybody listening right now, starting a podcast, and yes, I do have a broadcast that's on the actual radio too, but like, the podcast has been so much more rewarding, and I don't even care if nobody listens. It's just extremely therapeutic. Hey, that sounds nice. Geek Therapy Radio. Why wouldn't it be therapeutic? It's just very therapeutic for me just to talk into this microphone. I know that the purpose of me talking to the microphone is to talk to you guys and you gals and kind of introduce you to kind of geeky things. Mostly what winds up happening is I'm just kind of introducing you to my brain or telling you what's going on in my brain. And I might hit on some subjects that are kind of fascinating to you and sharing other people's geek things, having different interviews on here. By the way, tomorrow I am scheduled to have Colin Worth from This Does Not Compute on YouTube back on the channel. He's one of my favorite people to talk to on this podcast. But yeah, the podcast has been so artistically and creatively satisfying to me. And remember, I have my roots starting with being a musician. I record a lot of music. I still record music from time to time when I have time. But coming from a musician, I implore you, if you're a musician, start a podcast. And I do know that, obviously you don't have to, but I just highly encourage you to. The excuse I usually hear is, I don't know what to talk about. Just turn on the microphone and start talking. Because here's the beauty of it. You can practice all you want. You can record all you want. No one's going to hear it unless you give it to them. Unless you upload it somewhere. So just start recording something. You can use your phone to podcast. You don't have to have any equipment to podcast. I'm just telling you, if you're a creative person, usually creative people also have the side effect of maybe being more anxious than others, having more anxiety than others, being more susceptible to depression than others. If you're a creative, podcast. Just record your thoughts, stream of consciousness. And I'll tell you another thing. I can tell you from personal experience that my biggest fear going into it, especially when I got a radio show greenlit, was, holy crap, how can I keep talking about anything for 10 minutes for a radio segment, let alone, 40 minutes for an entire radio show? How can I talk about anything straight, for 2 minutes? How can I just keep talking for 2 minutes about anything, let alone 10, let alone 40? And do you know what the problem is? The actual problem that occurs, and you'll find this out sooner than later, sooner than you think. Case in point, these podcasts, I wanted them to originally be in between 10 and 20 minutes, perfectly consumable for the average drive home from work or to work every day. The problem I found, in that you will find quickly sooner than later, is that the trick becomes knowing when to shut up. And perhaps I will never know when to shut up. But maybe that's a good thing for a podcaster or a broadcaster, the ability to stream consciousness. So the problem now is, especially when I'm putting together the radio show that is on a set time limit, where first segment is 8 minutes, next segment is 10 minutes, next segment's 11 minutes, and the last segment is 10 minutes, 8, 10, 11, 10, is confining my stream of consciousness to those parameters. That's a skill. That is a broadcaster skill. The best broadcasters have this sense of rhythm and tempo. And no, they can't be completely on their game 100% of the time. To let you behind the curtain a little bit, my weekday job, my 9 to 5, which is really noon to 8, for those of you who know me, I run KTRH. So I run Rush Limbaugh here in Houston. We're just an affiliate. Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, whatever. I'll zip my lips a little bit. I will appeal to Rush Limbaugh's professionalism in that he's a broadcasting legend. It doesn't matter if you host the most left-wing liberal show ever on NPR. There's not one host who ever got into radio that does not respect Rush Limbaugh's professionalism and ability behind the microphone. They might 100% disagree with everything that Rush Limbaugh says. And believe me, there are some things that Rush Limbaugh says, especially when he gets on the global warming trip, that I'm just like, Rush, you need to shut up about that stuff because you don't know what you're talking about. But there are other times, even if I disagree with him, he has a respectable argument and he carries his argument very well. He's a very, very, very good broadcaster. Don Imus was one of the best broadcasters ever. Howard Stern is a great broadcaster. And what they have in common is they have this cadence and this tempo and this awareness of the flow and the feeling and where they're at on time. They have this sense of where they're at on the clock, in the clock. The clock is the radio Bible. It is the guidelines of broadcasters. You actually look at the physical clock and the seconds ticking, and you know your time limits in and out of breaks, because usually they're hard-timed breaks. And you can keep the cadence and the tempo and the self-awareness of where you are on the clock with time. It's a very, very good ability to have, and the best broadcasters have it. That said, even the best of them can be a little bit out of sync some days. I definitely feel that in some of my broadcasts, especially, that I'll wrap up a show and I'll be like, oh man, that one was good. I felt really good. The cadence and tempo of my topics and the flow of each segment was great, and my awareness of time was great. I felt like that was a really good show. And then there's other times that even if it came across to you as good, I felt off. And that's just one of those skills that you hone and develop and become more precise with when you do something like broadcasting. And it helps you, broadcasting or podcasting. I say the broadcast is just promotion for the podcast. But it's a very valuable skill, I think, to be able to have that stream of consciousness and be aware of time constraints and have the flow of conversation evolve naturally. It is something I continually learn, and I know that there's a lot of people listening. I'm still learning. You know what? I've had my show for 2 or 3 years now. Man, I haven't even scratched the surface of becoming the professional that I hope to one day become behind a microphone. Those of you who've been listening to Geek Therapy Radio from the beginning, you know the evolution. I can hear it when I go back to listen to early episodes of Geek Therapy Radio. They're more cringeworthy than the last show I put up, the most recent shows. And that's when I say that I appreciate everyone who listens, that's one reason. It's because you guys are here on the ground floor and you're bearing with me when some shows are good, some shows are bad, some are not your cup of tea. I just appreciate that you're here along for the ride with me. Another thing I'd like to bring up, because it just popped into my head, is if you look at the podcast now, I'm always tinkering and experimenting with what I do behind the scenes. So, for instance, one of the things behind the scenes is I'm the one who writes the titles and descriptions for each of the podcasts. And it just dawned on me one day that, I preach on here that we're all geeks about something. So embrace your inner geek. Whatever you're into, whether it's running soundboards, or flying kites, or building airplanes, or playing with train sets, or whatever the heck, electronics. Whatever your geek thing is, it's very wide and diverse. So one of the things I've started to do on the podcast, if you've noticed, is I've started to categorize as best I can going forward here, as best I can, kind of the genre of each podcast. So, for instance, when I had Chris Henderson on from Hendy Amps, I put that in the genre of electronics. And by genre, I mean that I'm physically typing in, what genre that each podcast is. So one reason is because I want people rifling through the podcast to see that, oh, this one is cars. Cars interests me. So it says cars and then the divider and then the title of whatever the podcast is. It's so you can quickly go through and see, oh, painting. I haven't labeled anything painting yet, but if I do talk about painting or have an artist on here, something like that, then I would say painting and then the divider. I talk with local artist, Blobbity Blue, about a mural she did. So I'm trying to label things like that by genre per podcast to help further categorize and help further help my listeners further with, hey, this is in the genre that I don't really care about. I'll skip this one and I'll go to the one that has a genre that I do care about, or vice versa. Maybe you don't care about cars, but maybe it might be fascinating to you to listen to a show about cars. Either way, you know what you're getting into before you listen to the podcast. Just in general, you know what you're getting into in general. I may title the podcast something kind of vague. It might be more specific. Doesn't matter what I title the actual podcast, but when I categorize it, at least you'll have a general idea of what you're about to get into. Oh, there's one more thing. At least one more thing that I wanted to talk about in tonight's podcast. I've got a new CRT. Oh, electronics. Yeah, okay. So I got a new CRT monitor, but I'm gonna hold off on that discussion until I have Colin on tomorrow. CRT computer monitors, those big glass, heavy, bulky, massive old things that most people, for good reason, have thrown away by years. For years now, since we have flat panels and flat screens and all sorts of stuff. I say for good reason, because most people aren't the type of geek that I am. Of course, I love flat panel displays, LEDs, OLEDs, LCDs, TFT, all the different technology of flat panel, ultra high definition displays. But one thing that I've realized, and that a lot of other people have realized, and even more and more people are realizing, especially gamers, people who like to play video games, is that CRTs still have qualities about them that are extremely desirable. They have very, very high refresh rates. They handle resolution scaling perfectly. They're very versatile. They have very deep blacks. They have very crisp images. There's so much to a CRT to love. And I don't think I will ever not have a CRT in my arsenal ever again. I went to an electronics shop and got this thing, or electronics recycler. Picked this thing up for $30, I think it was. It's an HP Pavilion M70. And CRTs are so good. VGA, XVGA CRTs, SVGA, whatever. They're so good. They are such a sight for sore eyes. The refresh rate, so good. All right, so this is the last thing I want to talk about in the podcast this evening as I'm recording. Oh my goodness, it's 2:35 in the morning. Okay. I've been getting onto this electronics kick. And, should I say this for another podcast? Yeah, I'll save it for another podcast. So I've been getting to an electronics kick since I've visited with Chris Henderson of Hendy Amps, but I'll save that, my electronics dabblings, for another podcast. This one has already gone on for 30 minutes. Hope you liked hearing me ramble. Hopefully there's something in there that is helpful to you. I mean, that's the goal with all this, is that even despite it might, just be me rambling for 30 minutes or so each day, or near as each day as possible. I don't think I put, again, I think I owe you guys an extra podcast. But either way, even if it's just me rambling and stream of consciousness, I hope you pick your things out there that are helpful to you. To recap, the main point today is, if you are creative and you are prone to anxiety or depression, something like that, starting a podcast can be extremely therapeutic. It has been extremely therapeutic to me. It has itched my creative itch like few things have. I get the same sense of satisfaction I get out of music by doing podcast. And something else, real quick, in the vein of podcast that I'll just mention as I'm bringing it back up. Don't worry too much about equipment. Don't fret too much about where do I even start with microphones and preamps and interfaces and all that stuff. Don't worry about it. If you're a musician, you probably already have all that stuff anyways. If you're not a musician, odds are you have a smartphone that you can record audio into. Has a microphone on it. Just start doing it. And here's an open call. If you do start doing a podcast, I will help you. How do I phrase this? Because I don't want to take on too much. I'm only one man. If you need any advice onto how to make your podcast sound better, record what you got and send it to me. If you want to. I'm not pressuring you to do this. I'm just saying, if you want to start a podcast and you want people to hear it, or you already have a podcast and people already do hear it, and you want some advice on how to make it sound better, I would love to help you out in that regard. Just send me an email. GeekTherapy@iheartmedia.com. I include the link to it in every podcast description. Send me some audio and I'll help you with your tweaks. Send me the audio, but also describe to me kind of what you're using to record it with and put it together. And I'll try to give you as much advice as I hopefully can, because hopefully you hear that my podcast, and I'm not tooting my own horn or anything like that, but I am quite particular about my sound. I like to have everything nice and loud, so that you don't have to constantly adjust volumes, or that my guests are lower volume than me, or different people on the show are louder or quieter than others. I need everything nice and even, but dynamic and punchy, and hopefully the sound of my podcast. I hope what happens is you listen to other podcasts, even other professional podcasts. If you come to me from Mark Maron or Adam Carolla or any other Joe Rogan or something like that, that you come to my podcast and you're like, why is this so much louder than everybody else's? Well, it's not just that it's louder, like it's not clipped and it's not all just smashed and brick walled and pushed up to 0 decibels as far as possible. That's not it. I just take a lot of care in the compression that I use and how I master each one of these, the limiters that I use, and I just bring everything nice and hot, but keeping it dynamic and keeping it clear. And so I think it's funny that in podcasts, something that separates the men from the boys, so to speak, is the amount of care they put into the audio. That said, good audio does not make a good podcast. One of my favorite podcasts, and I'm so glad that I'm remembering this, and I'm sorry this is going on so long, but one of my favorite podcasts right now is a local Houston group called Effin' Rager. A guy at Micro Center told me about it, and I've just blanked out on his name. If you're that guy and you're listening to my podcast now, email me, GeekTherapy@iheartmedia.com, or I'll see you next time I'm in Micro Center, because I will be in there again. It's my Disneyland. But he mentioned this podcast called Effin' Rager. And it's freaking awesome. It's just 3 or 4 guys just joking around some microphones. It's so great. It is such a great show. Effin' Rager. And maybe I shouldn't be plugging them too much, but the point is, their audio game isn't 100%. But it doesn't need to be 100%. Their joy, their energy, whatever they do, transcends gear and equipment and audio engineering know-how. It's not important. If you got something to say and people want to hear it, you could record it on a micro cassette tape and put it out there, and it will resonate with people. So while I put a lot of effort into consistency of my audio, it doesn't matter if my content is crap. I could talk on that vein for another hour if I needed to, but I'm not going to. Thank you for coming along with me on this experiment. Like I said, I've been doing it 2 or 3 years. It's a constant experiment, constant tinkering, and it can only get better from here. Not that it's bad. You know, maybe it's not everyone's cup of tea, but I'm not really concerned with everybody liking it. I'm concerned with the right people liking it. I'm not concerned with getting as big an audience as humanly possible out of people that won't appreciate it. I don't need people who don't care, knowing my name. I need to get my audience. So if it resonates with you, if you are my audience, I very much appreciate that. If you're one of the type of people that my motto and my mission resonates with, I appreciate that. And here's the motto and the mission, and this is how I'll wrap up the show. We are all geeks about something, and that's a beautiful thing. So embrace your inner geek and share your inner geek with others, because you never know how sharing your inner geek, your hobbies, your passions with others might inspire them to rekindle their old hobbies or start a new hobby. Maybe they see what you're into and they take interest in it and they get really into it, and you may have just saved someone's life. You may have saved somebody from the pit of despair or pits of depression by rekindling an old hobby or letting them discover a new hobby through you. And that's what I try to do on Geek Therapy Radio, is try to be a conduit towards that result of sharing my geek thing and sharing other people's geek things with each other. Because I truly believe that geek therapy works. Be good to yourselves and others. Know that you are worthy of love. You are worthy of giving love. You are worthy of receiving love. You are worthy of your own self-respect. So each day, let's try to chip away at the wall between us and loving ourselves and respecting ourselves. There is no one magic cure-all that I can say that just cures you of your own self-pity and your own self-disrespect. But what I can say is that you can chip away at it each day by engaging in a hobby, engaging in a geek thing, learning about other people's geek things. That'll help you realize that, yes, you are worthy of love. Even your own self-respect. That's the hardest thing in the world, is to respect ourselves. It's the hardest thing in the world to love ourselves. So let's just keep chipping away at it with some good geek therapy. And our friends and family. Lean into your friends and family too. That's it for the Geek Therapy Radio podcast today. Like I said, send me an email, geektherapy@iheartmedia.com. Patreon's there too. 5% each month goes to help those with mental illness. Geek Therapy Radio on YouTube and all the social media. Basically, just Google Geek Therapy Radio. I'll come up and follow me. Like, follow, subscribe, all that good stuff. Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. Get at me on those things. I love hearing from my audience and engaging with them. But until tomorrow, be good to each other, including yourselves. And I'll talk to you later.
Geek Therapy Radio, Saturday night at 10 on KPRC 950. Or listen anytime on our iHeartRadio app.